American pressure on Israel, not Israel, while visiting Israel, and unacceptable to Israel, to the land of Israel. Hi, everyone. I am currently at the National Conservatism Conference in Washington, D.C. That's why I'm not in my normal studio. And I'm honored to be in person here with my dear friend, Frank Gaffney. Frank has been on the show numerous times, and he is, of course, the host of Securing America on Real America's Voice Network, and also is the founder of the Center for Security Policy here in Washington, D.C., one of the premier defense and security policy think tanks in the D.C. in the policy space. And Frank, you've been in this business in defense and security policy for many years. You served in the Reagan administration. And with all of our conversations and our friendship, one question I've never really asked you is, when back then in the 1980s, when you're working in the Reagan administration, what did Israel policy look like then? And at what point or how did you see the change come about to what it is today? Like, is there a story behind Israel policy of the United States of America?
Oh, there decidedly is a story behind it. The piece of it that was playing out while I was in the Pentagon was somebody else's portfolio. So I was kind of watching it, but mostly from afar. I worked on sort of the Soviet portfolio. I acted as an assistant secretary of defense, and the Israel and basically the rest of the world was the portfolio of a fellow by the name of Richard Armitage, who was an assistant secretary for international security affairs, as they called it. Our portfolio was international security policy, confused everybody. The point is that my perception of what was going on is kind of at a remove, but what was unmistakable is I think Rich Armitage brought to the job a certain animus towards Israel that unfortunately you find in a lot of official Washington, notably in the State Department. Rich went on to become a deputy secretary of state under Colin Powell. But he kind of, it always seemed to me, had a bit of antipathy. In fairness to him, I think that Cap Weinberger, for whom we both worked, had a bit of antipathy towards Israel as well.
Yeah, that was pretty well known at the time.
Self-hating Jew is what some people, I think suggested was the case. He was an Episcopalian, I think, during his lifetime, but he definitely felt that Israel was not the cornerstone of a sound American policy in the region. Maybe it was his time at Bechtel. There was a lot of that going on too, as you know. But whether it was the diplomatic proclivities in Washington policy towards the Middle East, or whether it was the business elements at work, during that particular period, I think it's fair to say, there was not a lot of enthusiasm about Israel as the cornerstone of our policy in the Middle East. I don't think that was true of Ronald Reagan, by the way, but these were key people shaping the policy day to day. George Shultz is widely credited with being more sympathetic to Israel. I was never quite so convinced of that.
Neither was I.
Another Bechtel guy, by the way, working in the State Department, of course. So it was an odd arrangement whereby Cap, who I loved and who I was really privileged to work with, was extremely robust and sound, I thought, on a lot of issues in my portfolio particularly. But that was always one that I didn't see eye to eye with him.
Yeah, it's interesting because at the time, like during the Cold War, relations between Israel and the United States and Israel's enemies were somewhat more simplified than they are today, in that the Arab countries were part of the Soviet bloc. They were funded by the Soviets. They were part of, everything was very binary, and they were in the Soviet orbit. And Israel was, of course, in the American orbit, and therefore seeing the Israel-Arab conflict as a front in the Cold War should seem to be a kind of obvious point. And the reason I asked you that question about how they were perceived is that, when you go back in the history of the State Department, since the founding of the State of Israel, going all the way back to Truman's decision to recognize the State of Israel, it was always the permanent State Department people who were less favorable to Israel than the elected branch. And that's why I was asking that question. So you've been in this space.
Well, and I would argue
that's
a function of the fact that elected people represent the American people. And the American people have historically, I think, overwhelmingly, including today, by the way, been supportive of the State of Israel. Those permanent bureaucrats or foreign service officers, the elite, if you will, have generally had a very different view for one of these reasons. Maybe in some places it's just out and out anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism, which I consider to be the same thing. But I think there is a caveat to what you said. I think, there were some in the Middle East, notably the Saudis, who were not so much in the Soviet war, but they were very Sharia supremacist, I call them. Still are, I think, in many ways. But they were more or less aligned with us. And certainly the Shah of Iran was aligned with us. But there were others, as you say, that bought into the Soviet sort of program and in some cases afforded them opportunities to operate in the Middle East as well. Very much a front in the Cold War, yes.
Yeah, and the analog is interesting to today, where the Chinese are behind the Iranians and funding them basically by purchasing their oil and these strategic agreements they have, who are, of course, behind all of the Iranian proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, etc. And
trying to recruit the Saudis and
and trying to bring them in, and it's working. Those more moderate Arab nations that were more in the American orbit are moving closer to China now, and so it's kind of, in a certain sense, it's a repeat of that situation where there's a bloc that is aligned against the United States that is also attacking Israel, but it seems that there's less clarity now, where at the time, back in the Cold War, at least for the American people, as you said, and for people like yourself, it was very clear that Israel is on America's side, that the enemies of Israel are also the enemies of America, because they were aligned with the Soviets, and it was very clear to everyone that the Soviets were the American enemy. And today, where the U.S. is in business with the Chinese, the U.S. government is, and the U.S. government is enabling the Iranians, it's a less clear picture.
I think it's actually every bit as clear. It's just that our policies are obscuring some of the underlying realities. And this is what makes it so, dangerous, for one thing, and mystifying in others. Why would the United States government want to prop up the Iranians? I mean, if you ask the average American, I don't think they'd have a clue.
Do you have an answer for it?
Well, I personally ascribe a lot of it to just plain corruption, and also to an appetite to weaken the United States that I believe it was evident in the Obama-Biden years. And now, though it is nominally the Biden years, I think it's the third Obama-Biden term, this has become more and more and more virulently evident that they're all in for having Iran become the dominant nation in the region. Israel, if not, I hate to say this, but if not actually liquidated, certainly greatly diminished in terms of its power and its capability to defend itself, let alone our interests. Again, this doesn't make any strategic sense to me, but I think that is the policy of the U.S. government today.
So, Frank, just in the minute or so that we have left, what would be your policy prescription if you were asked by an incoming new administration, God willing, Trump wins the next election, and they wanted you to tell them, okay, how should we be handling Israel? How should we be handling the Middle East?
I basically say reboot. Do essentially what Donald Trump was doing the last time around. Recognize that Israel is indispensable to our security interests as well as a key ally, shared values and all the rest. And that Iran and the people who I think now essentially are calling the shots in Iran, namely the Chinese Communist Party, are our mortal enemies as well as Israel's. And we want to help Israel, fashion reliable alliances elsewhere in the region. But if Israel is powerful, that will be, I think, the inevitable effect of it, and it will weaken our enemies and theirs.
All right, thank you, Frank Gaffney, and thank you for watching. Frank, it's always an honor and a pleasure to spend time with you.
God bless you, my friend.
God bless.
What is it about the Holy Land? Why is the world obsessed with Israel? Why can the world turn away? See this land with your own eyes. Walk its ancient hills. Discover the roots of your faith. Meet the heroes of Israel. Stand with them and give them strength.
Be a part of the greatest story in the history of mankind. Stand with the people of Israel. Encourage God's nation, for the day is coming when many people shall go and say, "Come, let us go up to the Lord's mountain, and let him teach us his ways, and we will go in his path. For out of Zion shall the Torah come forth, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem."
Israel 365's Heartland Tour is the once-in-a-lifetime trip you've always dreamed of. The Holy Land is calling. Now is the time to make your dream come true.